Three words are trending across Nigerian Twitter right now. Tinubu must resign. But here's what almost nobody reporting this story is telling you. The people demanding that resignation know better than anyone else in the country that it cannot legally happen. Not like this, not from a press conference in Abuja. So why would a sitting minority leader of the House of Representatives, a trained legislator who understands the Nigerian constitution better than the average citizen ever will, stand in front of cameras and call for a resignation he knows the constitution does not permit him to force? That is the real question. Not will Tinubu resign, he won't. The real question is, what is this call actually for? And who is it actually aimed at? Before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, welcome. Naija Inside Desk exists for one reason: to give you the kind of analysis that goes beyond the headlines and the noise. Subscribe now because this conversation is about to get deeper. Let's establish exactly what happened, because the headlines have compressed three separate developments into one explosive sentence, and that compression is hiding the real story. On Wednesday, June 17th, Fred Agbedi, the minority leader of the House of Representatives, sat down for an interview on Channels Television's Politics Today. He didn't mince words. He said if President Tinubu cannot provide leadership and security for Nigerians, he should quit. He invoked his own history, reminding viewers that during the Buhari administration, he stood on the floor of the House and declared that government had failed too. His argument: accountability cut across party lines, across administrations, across whoever sits in Aso Rock. But that interview didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened against the backdrop of three converging crises. First, the Oyo State abduction. In mid-May, school children and teachers were kidnapped in the Orire local government area of Oyo State. More than a month later, as of this recording, they remain in captivity. President Tinubu sent a delegation, his chief of staff, the national security advisor, the inspector general of police, but did not personally visit. Agbedi seized on this directly, contrasting it with a presidential visit to Jos after an earlier security incident, a visit he characterized as rushed and performative. Second, the death of retired Major General Rabe Abubakar. The former director of Defense Information was abducted along with his wife in Katsina State on May 30th. On June 13th, the Katsina State government confirmed his death in captivity, attributing it to complications from diabetes and hypertension. His family disputes that account entirely. They say he had no such medical history, and some reports point instead to a snake bite. His wife remains in captivity. The contradictory accounts of how his body was even recovered have deepened public distrust, not eased it. For a retired general, a man who once stood at the podium briefing the nation on the behalf of the armed forces, to die this way, in captivity, with the government's own story falling apart under scrutiny, is the kind of symbol that opposition politicians don't have to manufacture. It manufactures itself. Third, the judiciary. A federal high court ruling by Justice Peter Lifu ordered the deregistration of several opposition parties. The Minority Caucus has folded this into their list of grievances, framing it as evidence of a deliberate strategy to weaken opposition ahead of 2027. And they've gone further than just complaining. They are demanding the Chief Justice of Nigeria personally intervene over what they call conflicting judicial decisions on party registration. So when the caucus issued its formal demands, suspend all 2027 political activity, declare a 6-month national security and economic recovery plan, launch a transparent investigation into General Rabe's death, and have the CJN resolve the judicial conflict, they were not improvising. They were stacking three live national wounds into one political moment. And the Conference of United Political Groups, a coalition of opposition groups, moved within 24 hours to publicly back the caucus's position. That speed tells you this was coordinated, not spontaneous. Now, let's talk about what the Constitution actually says, because this is where the gap between political theater and legal reality becomes impossible to ignore. Removing a sitting Nigerian president is governed by Section 143 of the 1999 Constitution. It is not a vote of confidence. It is not a parliamentary system where a no-confidence motion can topple a government overnight. It is an impeachment process requiring a detailed allegation of gross misconduct, an investigation by a panel appointed by the Chief Justice, and ultimately a two-thirds majority in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. Here is the arithmetic the Minority Caucus knows intimately. The All-Presidential Congress holds a commanding majority in both chambers of the National Assembly. A two-thirds vote against a sitting APC president, engineered by an opposition that doesn't even control a simple majority, is not just unlikely. Under the current numbers, it is structurally impossible. Fred Agbedi is not a junior backbencher who doesn't understand this. He is the minority leader. He knows the math as well as anyone in that chamber. So what does Tinubu must resign actually mean? Institutionally, it means nothing. There is no mechanism by which a Minority Caucus press conference converts into a presidential exit. What the caucus actually possesses is something different, and in some ways more durable: the power of public framing, the power to set the terms of how a crisis gets discussed in the public square, even when they cannot legislate an outcome. And then there's the judiciary piece, which is its own institutional fault line. When opposition lawmakers call on the Chief Justice of Nigeria to personally intervene over conflicting judicial decisions on party registration, they are pointing at something real: a perception, fair or not, that different courts are producing different outcomes on questions that should have one settled answer under electoral law. Whether that's judicial inconsistency or simply the normal friction of an adversarial legal system playing out in public, the ambiguity itself becomes politically useful. Ambiguity always benefits whoever can spend more time and money relitigating it, and that has historically favored incumbents with state resources, not the opposition raising the complaint. So here is where legitimate authority ends and political theater begins. The caucus has every right, under freedom of speech and parliamentary privilege, to say a government has failed and should step aside. That is democratic expression, full stop. What they do not have is the institutional power to convert that statement into removal. Conflating the two, letting viewers believe a resignation is constitutionally imminent, is where coverage of this story tends to mislead.
So if this isn't really about forcing a resignation, what is it actually doing? Let's follow the incentives. Start with who gains. The Minority Caucus gains visibility and moral positioning at minimal cost. A press conference costs nothing. It does not require winning a single vote. And by tying the resignation call to three sympathetic, emotionally resonant tragedies: captive school children, a dead general whose own government can't keep its story straight, and a court ruling that conveniently disadvantages opposition parties, they've constructed a narrative that's difficult for the presidency to rebut without sounding defensive. The Conference of United Political Parties gains too. By aligning within a day, CUPP positions itself as the coalition standing with elected opposition voices, rather than fragmented individual critics. That's coalition building with 2027 in clear view. And notice who else has joined this chorus, because it matters. An APM chieftain in Oyo Central called for resignation back in late May, tied to the same abduction. And inside the APC's own structure, a media aide in Akwa Ibom, Osborne Okon, was sacked after publicly writing that Tinubu should honorably resign. That detail is significant. When dissent shows up inside the ruling party's own state apparatus, even at a junior level, it tells you the resignation framing isn't purely an opposition talking point being manufactured from outside. It's finding traction inside APC's own ranks, even if leadership is moving fast to suppress it. Now, who loses? The presidency loses control of the narrative tempo at minimum. Every day this conversation dominates Nigerian political media is a day not spent talking about economic reform wins or security successes the administration might prefer to highlight. And reputationally, the optics of the Oyo non-visit, a delegation sent instead of the president himself, gave the opposition a clean, visual contrast to weaponize. So what does this signal about 2027? Everything. Agbedi explicitly accused the APC and the presidency of prioritizing political calculations for 2027 over governance. That's not incidental rhetoric. It's the central frame opposition figures are building for the entire next election cycle. Security failure as the defining indictment of this administration, with the deregistration ruling positioned as proof the government is more focused on weakening rivals than fixing the country. And who is conspicuously silent here? Watch the presidency's formal response or the absence of one in the days following this. A rapid, defensive rebuttal would suggest the administration feels exposed. A measured, security-focused response, perhaps a visit, perhaps an announcement, would suggest they are choosing to manage the optics rather than dispute the substance. Either way, silence itself is a strategic choice, not a neutral one. Now, if what you just heard challenges what you thought you knew, drop it in the comments. I want to hear your read on this before we get to the part that reframes everything. Strip away the resignation theater, and what's left is a set of consequences that touch every Nigerian, regardless of which side of this argument they're on. On federal-state power balance, security operations in Katsina and Oyo depend on coordination between federal security architecture and state governments. When that coordination produces contradictory accounts, as it did with General Rabe's death, where the state government's medical explanation collapsed under family scrutiny, it doesn't just embarrass officials, it erodes the public's baseline trust that any government account of a security incident can be taken at face value, federal or state. On the economy, political instability narratives, even ones without legal teeth, affect investor sentiment and currency confidence. A resignation headline circulating internationally, even when domestically understood as rhetorical, creates noise that the naira and foreign investment conversations don't need on top of existing pressure. On security itself, this is the sharpest point. When armed groups can hold a retired Major General, a man who once represented the Nigerian Armed Forces publicly for 2 weeks, extract a hostage video demanding the release of detained associates, and ultimately deliver a body under disputed circumstances, that is not just a tragedy, it is a demonstration to every other criminal network in the country of exactly how much leverage hostage-taking now carries against the state. Emboldening is not a metaphor here, it is the literal observable effect of unresolved high-profile captivity cases. On regional and ethnic tension, the Oyo abduction sits in the southwest, Tinubu's own home region, a detail that complicates any narrative of this being a simple north versus south or ethnic grievance. This is at its core a national governance failure story, and treating it as anything narrower than that does a disservice to the scale of what's actually happening. And for Nigerians living below the poverty line, the people genuinely furthest from any of this political maneuvering, none of it changes their daily exposure to insecurity or economic hardship. Whether Tinubu resigns, doesn't resign, or simply outlasts the news cycle, the kidnapping risk on rural roads and the price of food in the market does not move because a press conference happened in Abuja. Nigeria does not get to have this conversation in isolation, and the diaspora in particular needs to understand why. Within West Africa, Nigeria has spent the last several years positioning itself as the anchor state for democratic stability, explicitly contrasting itself against a region that has seen multiple military overthrows in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Guinea. Every Resign Now headline coming out of Abuja, even when it's domestic political theater rather than a genuine constitutional threat, feeds into a regional narrative that Nigeria's own democratic stability is fraying. ECOWAS and the African Union are watching, not because they expect Tinubu to actually leave office, because instability rhetoric from Africa's largest democracy has outsized signaling power across the continent. Internationally, there are already reports of the United States deepening its involvement in Nigeria's security crisis, a development that intersects directly with this story. Foreign governments calibrate engagement levels based partly on perceived domestic political stability, and a sustained government in crisis narrative, even an exaggerated one, shapes those calculations. For Nigerians in the UK, the US, Canada, and South Africa, here is the practical takeaway. This is not a coup narrative, and it is not an imminent resignation. It is a high-stakes political messaging battle ahead of 2027, using real tragedies as ammunition. Understanding that distinction matters because diaspora remittance decisions, investment decisions, and even how you discuss Nigeria with non-Nigerian colleagues abroad depend on getting the actual stakes right rather than the headline version.
Let's steelman the opposition's position properly, because it deserves a fair hearing before any pushback. Their strongest argument is this: Democratic accountability does not require a removal mechanism to be legitimate. Agbedi's own framing, that both the minority in government and free citizens have the right to say, perform or quit, is not a fringe position. It's a basic democratic norm. Citizens and elected opposition figures are entitled to publicly demand better governance, and pointing to a captive general whose death the government's own account cannot fully explain, alongside children still missing more than a month after their abduction, is not opportunism. It's citing exactly the kind of failures that accountability politics exists to surface. Now, the most common misconception circulating online is that this resignation call represents some imminent legal or political threat to Tinubu's hold on power. It does not. As we established, the numbers in the National Assembly make impeachment a non-starter, and a verbal call for resignation carries no constitutional weight whatsoever. Treating this as Tinubu could actually be forced out misunderstands how Nigerian presidential removal works, and that misunderstanding is exactly what makes the headline so shareable, and exactly what makes it misleading. The nuance being lost in the noise is this. This is simultaneously a legitimate accountability demand and a calculated 2027 positioning maneuver. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. The caucus can be genuinely outraged by these security failures and also be strategically maximizing the political value of that outrage. Pretending it's purely one or purely the other flattens a story that is in reality both at once. So what does this mean specifically for Nigeria's democratic trajectory? It means the country is watching its opposition test how far rhetorical accountability can travel in a system where institutional accountability mechanisms are numerically unreachable. That test, repeated enough times across enough crises, either strengthens civic pressure as a real check on power, or it cheapens the language of resignation until nobody on any side takes it seriously anymore. Where does this go from here? Three likely paths. The first, the presidency manages this quietly. No direct rebuttal to the resignation language itself, but a visible response on the substance. A presidential visit to Oyo, a public update on the investigation into General Rabe's death, or an announcement resembling the security framework the caucus demanded, repackaged as the administration's own initiative rather than a concession to opposition pressure. The second is escalation. More opposition-aligned figures, more sacked or disciplined ACP members who spoke out of turn, and possibly civil society groups joining the chorus, turning isolated demands into a sustained pressure campaign running into the lead-up to 2027 primaries and conventions. The third is the story fades within the standard Nigerian news cycle, overtaken within 1 to 2 weeks by the next breaking development, unless one of the underlying threads, particularly the unresolved Oyo captivity or further developments in the Rabe Abubakar case, produces a new flashpoint that reignites it. Here's what to watch for in the coming days and weeks. Any movement on the Oyo children's release, any formal government response to the family's disputed account of General Rabe's death, any statement from the CJN's office on the conflicting party registration rulings, and whether the presidency grants Agbedi's resignation comments a direct response or simply lets them pass unanswered. This escalates if the Oyo captivity drags on without resolution, if more credible accounts emerge contradicting the official narrative on General Rabe's death, or if additional ACP figures publicly break ranks. It de-escalates if there's a clean, verifiable resolution to the Oyo case or a credible, transparent accounting of what actually happened in Katsina. Over the next 12 months, this becomes one data point in a much larger 2027 security and governance narrative the opposition is clearly assembling piece by piece. Over a 3-year horizon, whether this moment is remembered as a turning point depends entirely on whether insecurity measurably improves or worsens between now and Election Day, because that, not this press conference, is what voters will actually be weighing. So let's return to the question we opened with. Can this opposition actually force Tinubu out, and what is this call actually for? The honest answer is no.
not through impeachment, not through this caucus, not with these numbers in the National Assembly. What the Minority Caucus has built instead is a narrative framework anchored in 3 real painful national wounds designed to define how Nigerians remember this period of governance heading into 2027. That is not nothing. Narrative control has shaped Nigerian elections before, but it is categorically different from the resignation headline we're currently circulating, and conflating the two does a disservice to anyone trying to understand what is actually at stake. I'm not going to hand you a prediction dressed up as certainty. What I will say is this. Watch the Oyo case, watch what becomes of the investigation into General Rabe's death, and watch whether the judiciary's conflicting rulings get resolved or simply get politicized further. Those 3 threads, not this press conference, will tell you where Nigeria's institutions actually stand. I want you to push back on this analysis if you disagree. Is this purely cynical positioning, or is there more genuine accountability instinct here than I'm giving it credit for? Tell me in the comments. And there's one thread we're deliberately leaving open for next time. That judicial conflict over party deregistration isn't just a footnote in this story. It may be the bigger institutional crisis hiding underneath it. If this analysis gave you clarity, not agreement, clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what is actually happening. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.